Welcome to the screencast for What Can I Know by D.Z. Phillips, and you'll find this on page 82 in our textbook. This article is a direct response to the article from Bertrand Russell that we read in the last module. If you have your textbook open and you're following along, you might notice that there's a little blurb or introduction to each article in our textbook. And the editor wrote those to offer some insight for us to philosophical methods, definitions, and processes, so they can be quite valuable. In this one, Stephen Kahn, the editor, tells us about the larger scope of philosophical discourse. So when one philosopher raises an issue or doubts about some belief, either that philosopher themselves or others in the community can attempt to solve those doubts. And in that way, each argument that is created joins into a long conversation that's lasted for thousands of years. That's another way that professional or academic philosophy and other fields is differentiated to speculation that the average person might do. In this specific article, Phillips looks at the doubts about reality and appearance that Russell discussed and tries to solve the doubts that Russell raised. First, he asks who philosophers are, and he remembers back to when he had just gotten accepted into college and never read any philosophy, even though he knew he was going to study it once he got to school. So in anticipation of that, he read an introductory book before he got there for his first semester. And what struck him is that philosophers are ultra cautious. They don't make snap judgments of any kind or decide what their beliefs are about anything very quickly. They make sure they're gathering all the evidence and thinking all of the definitions and concepts through. So he decided that philosophy is important to study because one of the biggest mistakes people make in their lives are rushing into judgment. He says, our day-to-day assumptions are shot through with contradictions and inconsistencies. A great deal of reflection is necessary before we can arrive at what we really know. Philosophy is an indispensable guide in this reflection. But when he dug deeper into the subject, and once he got to school and started taking the classes, he was really shocked at how deep philosophers' doubts could really go. They doubted ordinary things that seemed pointless to doubt, like Russell with his table, his sense data, and his sense perception. And he makes a bit of a reference to a joke where the first-year philosophy student goes home with his mind blown and he tries to shock his parents and has all this fake deep knowledge and asks questions like, so you think there's really a table there, don't you? And I just want to say as an aside, you don't always have to agree, again, with every bit of arguments that are presented to you. This could be considered a fallacious way of responding to an argument because it's considered a fallacy of relevance when you resort to humor or ridicule. You're not looking at the argument itself, you're distracting people away from it. But Phillips knows this, and he knows that we have to take Russell's ideas seriously, even if at first blush they seem ridiculous. And you want to ask yourself why someone would try to doubt the most evident or obvious things about our lives and our experience. What good could possibly come out of that? And that just because a claim feels silly or wrong immediately doesn't mean that it is refuted as wrong or it's worthless to reason. So you have to take your time and build up your rational justification as to why it's wrong. I have a little chart here. This also would work well for any kind of argumentative essay that you ever have to write. If you follow this, your structure and your argumentation will be clear as day. So now he wants to do the serious work of trying to prove Russell wrong. So first he asks, how is it that we come to know anything? And his first premise is that there must have been a time before we knew anything. And when it was like that, whether it was before we were conceived or before we were born or when we were kids, our minds must have been like an empty vessel waiting to be filled up. And the reason I put it the way I did is because we might think there's some kind of innate knowledge built into our heads by evolution or by God. You can see if you do believe in these kind of innate ideas, you have to have a clear definition of knowledge operating for you. Because you might wonder, why would something that's built into us before we're born count as knowledge? Does it count as a belief if it's just an instinct? Or is an instinct something else entirely different? Regardless, though, we do have some mechanisms in our brains and our bodies to gather or gain knowledge and information. So he says that the source of this information has to be outside of ourselves. Otherwise, we'd never be able to gain concepts like redness or coldness or sweetness. And this view of where we get knowledge is called empiricism. We'll talk about empiricism a fair bit in upcoming lectures, but all it means is that we get all of our knowledge from the outside world, from our experiences. It's not inside our heads, like I said, either put there by a deity or by evolution. So the sensations of heat, taste, and color, so this is what we feel. Phillips acknowledges that they turn into things that we call ideas, impressions, or sensations. So we don't know how much is our mind putting information into the sensations when we categorize them, and how much is coming in from the outside world itself. Either way, we need the mind as the aggregator of the ideas to understand our experience. But here's the skepticism. If we always need our mind to be the scaffolding of our experience, if we can't figure out where the mind ends and the sensation begins, it's tough to escape the idea that maybe our minds don't report the world accurately, or even at all. Our minds do all the work, perhaps. It could be feeding us 100% incorrect information or 0% of the outside world. The outside world might not even exist at all. If you've ever seen the movie The Matrix, this is a good analogy for this kind of idea. If our brains just need to take in signals, we could have signals that are deceiving us, so we might not know what the outside world is at all. On this view, you can't know anything exists except yourself, ever, because you can never really prove anything beyond this skepticism. That's known as a view called solipsism. And the key to this argument is that we can never have independent access to what creates ideas in our mind. So he has the examples of a golf ball and an apple on page 84. He says, and this is the second full paragraph down, maybe the second half of the paragraph. If I want to know what causes a bulge in my sock, I can take out the object causing the bulge, a golf ball, let's say, and find out what's causing it by doing so. In this example, I have independent access to the cause of the bulge in my sock. But when I want to know the cause of the ideas in my mind, I have no independent access to their cause. But in that case, how do I know that they're caused by anything or refer to anything? I seem to be locked in the circle of my own ideas. So we can see cause and effect in the outside world, but all we can see inside of our minds is effect. We can only see the thoughts that come up. We don't see the mechanisms that create them. Now, he uses, to further illustrate this, the apple. He says that in the next paragraph, let us suppose that my mental experience takes the form of an image of an apple. How do I know whether I'm seeing an apple or imagining an apple? If I'm imagining, that means my experience has no contact with a real object at all. But once again, I can only check this if I have independent access to the apple, which seems denied to me. So we are stuck in a loop. We can never get past the fact that our mind works on the data and we don't know how much. We don't know how much is scaffolding and how much is data. But he thinks there is a release from this skeptical loop. And he thinks you can figure it out by, instead of questioning the origins of where my ideas come from, which we don't have access to, we can instead question the assumptions behind the skepticism. And he uses another example to illustrate this. He says, if we hear a car and we say that we hear a car, Russell will say we're making an intuitive leap. Remember, intuition or inference means that we're using our mind and we're using reasons to get to a conclusion. So Russell would say all we have are the sense datum of some noise happening. It's a pattern of sounds. And we infer by using reason, and that's our mind scaffolding, to get to the idea that a car is passing near us. We're going beyond what we can actually know in that moment, which is the sounds themselves. So we're using machinery of our minds, and that can be doubted. Phillips, on the other hand, tells us that this idea that we only rely on our immediate sense data is not legitimate. And what he means by illegitimate is it's not reasonable. There's more to experience than sense data. So first off, he thinks, and I mean Phillips here, the author of this article, thinks that the quest for the most minimal sense datum is doomed to fail. So Russell told us that the most minimal sense datum are things like red and hard, and that's all we can tell in any given moment about anything. And that's why we can't say that we hear a car, because that claim's too complex. We also can't say that we can hear an engine noise, because we're still making inferences that that kind of noise is attached to an engine. We still might be mistaken. We can't say that we now seem to hear a purr, because it might be our imagination. We might be having a hallucination. So all we can say is, it seems to me right now, I think, that I hear a purring noise. So we can still doubt that this very most minimal claim, that I hear a noise, we can doubt that too. So there's no such way to get to the most minimal and actually get to something that's separate from our mental machinery and not actually a part of the outside world. So we lose the only evidence we have of the outside world on Russell's scheme, and that would be the sense datum, or the sense data that come in and bombard us. We can never get to it. Phillips says instead, why did we go in search of this minimal sense data in the first place? We did it because we felt that any statement about the outside world can always be doubted, and then if something can be doubted, it needs evidence. What we know immediately are minimal sense data, but is that true? Phillips doesn't think so. There are many experiences in life that count as favorable circumstances. So if we know we don't have cotton wool in our ears and we're outside and it's a sunny day and we can hear a car, that's a favorable circumstance. We hear and we see and taste and touch and smell clearly. These favorable circumstances, according to Phillips, do not need a judgment or a verdict from reason. They don't stand in need of evidence, in other words. Circumstances matter. On page 86, Phillips says, whether a statement stands in need of evidence depends on the circumstances in which it is made. Once this is admitted, we can see that there is no absolute distinction between two kinds of statement. One kind of statement that always needs evidence, and another kind of statement that always provides evidence. So this is kind of saying that on Russell's scheme, there's one kind of statement that always needs evidence, and that's what's in our head. And there's another kind of statement which always provides evidence, and that's the sense datum, or the sense data. But when you admit that the environment matters, that the circumstances and the context matter, then this distinction disappears. There's no such thing as one or the other. We've now rejected the terms or assumptions of the skeptical challenge. So instead of only sense data mattering and sensation mattering, the context matters as well. So at the very end of this article, he uses an example that's pretty well known to philosophy and the study of knowledge, that when you put a stick into water, it can look bent. So if we went on Russell's set of ideas, we would say that all that's available to us with this picture is bent yellow. And we'd have to think that that's the reality or the appearance that we get, and we can't see the reality behind it. But Phillips says illusions don't mean that we have to posit two realms, one mind that's totally isolated from the other, the world, and that making a mistake doesn't show that we need those two kinds of realms. All it means is that we need a better context. So we just make mistakes about the world sometimes, and when we gather more information and we're in a better context, we will see that the shape of the stick is not bent. So I guess what I want you to think about before you start the assignment is, do you think that Phillips refuted Russell's ideas about why appearance is all we can get to and we'll never get behind the appearances to the reality? Or do you think Russell's arguments are still strong? Remember, you can ask me questions about the content in the comments of this YouTube page.